There Will Be Wolves by Karleen Bradford, Chapter 2. The next day dawned dull and oppressive. There were ominous rumblings of thunder in the air. Ursula looked up at the sliver of sky that she could see between the houses on the narrow street. If it rained, she would have to take in all the remedies and herbs she was setting out on the front shutters. David had turned up early again and was sitting with his dog. He was already chattering at full speed. She wondered if he was ever silent. Still, the company was not unwelcome. Her father was feeling unwell and had not yet come down. A stray tabby cat she had been feeding wandered in through the open door and began to wind itself round her feet, mewing softly. The hackles on Samson's back rose, and he growled. David restrained him. The cat, as if realizing that there was no menace from this wounded dog, cast one scornful glance at it and then ignored it. "You are a brazen little thing," Ursula laughed, reaching down to scratch it behind the ears. 2 weeks ago you were so wild and unfriendly you wouldn't let me near you, and now look at you, you little beggar. Warm milk in the stomach makes for friendship, it seems, as far as you are concerned. She straightened up, only to see Mistress Elke sailing down the street towards them, her maidservant trailing behind. No, Ursula thought in a panic. I can't deal with her again. Father will be down in a minute. Let him tend to her. She dropped to her knees and crouched below the level of the open window. At the same time the cat, becoming impatient, leaped up onto the shutters. David looked at Ursula in astonishment, but she signaled to him to be silent. It was just possible that Mistress Elke had not seen her. She had been turning her head to chivy her maid when Ursula had caught sight of her. Ursula, feeling slightly foolish, crept on her hands and knees through the straw on the floor toward the stairs. Just at that moment, however, Mistress Elke's voice boomed out loud and strident. "Fetch your father, my girl. I'll have no dealings with you." The words stopped in mid-sentence. "Why, where did she go? Faith! She was here just a second ago. I turned my head for just a moment, and now she's gone. There's naught here but a cat. The devil himself couldn't have disappeared more quickly." Unable to control himself any longer, David began to giggle. Mercifully, Master William came down the stairs just then. He took in the scene, but only shook his head, and went quickly over to deal with Mistress Elke. Ursula gained the stairs, and darted up them to her room above. The day passed quietly. It was Good Friday, and all the Christian population of Cologne was preparing for Eastertide. Ursula went to church in the morning, her father in the afternoon. As a devout and humble Christian, he would participate in the dramatic ceremony of creeping to the cross on his knees in the darkened church of Great St. Martin. Again, David had stayed all day, but this time he had brought some bread and cheese for his noon meal. Being a Jew, he could not share their food. Toward late afternoon, at the time when the workers would be finished and heading for their homes, Ursula found herself glancing more and more often down the street. Without actually admitting to herself, she was wondering if Bruno would come again. When he did appear, however, she was busy putting her wares away for the night, and his voice startled her. "Hello! Have you heard the news?" he called out as he strode up to the shop. "How goes your dog?" he asked David as he caught sight of him. "Better, thank you, much better," David replied with a smile. In fact, the dog had begun to trot around the place almost nimbly. Ursula had renewed the poultices, and the swelling had gone down considerably. There had been no sign of fever at all. "What news?" Ursula asked. "There's a holy man camped in the meadow by the Church of the Apostles. Peter the Hermit, they call him. He comes from the Frankish lands, and they say he is telling of wondrous things. Tomorrow, Holy Saturday, he will preach. I intend to go hear him. Will you come with me?" "Yes," Ursula answered. "I would like that. My father also spoke of him and wishes to go. Shall we make our way together then?" "By all means. I'll come by early. If we make haste, we shall be able to get close enough to hear and see him clearly. They say he has been rousing multitudes since he's left his homelands, and a whole host of people follow him. He's preaching a holy pilgrimage, something called a crusade, to liberate Jerusalem from the heathen yoke." The next morning, Bruno and David arrived together. Leaving David to care for Samson, Ursula, her father, and Bruno set out for the field where the hermit was to preach. Soon they saw that others were following the same path. People thronged together, the normal excitement of the Easter weekend heightened by this new furor. The talk seemed to be of nothing else but the strange monk and his preachings. Ursula was astonished by the number of people walking along with them, but even more astonished when they arrived at the Church of the Apostles. Although the hermit, also called little Peter, had not yet arrived, the meadow was already full of his followers, speaking in a bewildering variety of dialects. Most of the dialects were Frankish, but there were others Ursula had never heard before and was at a loss to identify. Many of the people wore red crosses stitched or painted crudely onto their tunics and cloaks. They had barely arrived when a shout rose up from the multitude. Coming up the hill from behind the church straggled a short procession. Leading it was a donkey, and seated on it was a man, clad only in filthy rags. He passed directly in front of Ursula. She could see that he was barefoot and unshaven. His beard and long, stringy locks of hair were black, his face dark and sallow. He was as thin as the poor, emaciated beast he rode. As he passed by, people surged forward to touch him, or failing that, to pull the hairs out of his donkey's tail to keep as relics. The sparse number of hairs remaining testified to the number of people who had already collected theirs. "Cured a woman near death with childbed fever, they say," a woman next to Ursula avowed as she thrust past. "Just one hair!" Ursula stared at the hermit with disapproval. In a town situated on a river, and with a number of wells around, there was no shortage of water. Being godly did not necessarily mean being dirty as far as she was concerned. Beside her, Bruno looked equally unimpressed. Then, as Peter reached the steps of the church, he stopped. He looked around. Seated as he was on the donkey, everyone could see him. The donkey itself drooped disconsolately beneath him, as if mourning the loss of its tail hairs. Peter reached both hands out in front of him in a peaceful gesture, but his eyes seemed to flash in the sunlight. There was something both compelling and wild about him. The rabble was silenced almost immediately. His voice rang out. He spoke in a Frankish dialect, but was echoed instantly by a translator in the Germanic dialect that was most common along this part of the Rhine. The effect was doubly impressive. "I come with a message from God," the two voices seemed to fill the meadow. "I come to call you into God's service. Our brethren in the East are crushed and dying under the yoke of the infidels. Our churches are being desecrated. Jerusalem itself, holiest of all cities, is lost to us." There was an intensity and magnetism about the hermit as he spoke that was almost hypnotic. Ursula found herself caught up by it. Gradually, as she listened, she forgot it was the translator's words she heard, forgot her first impressions of distaste. She felt as if Peter's words were being etched directly onto her brain. Around her, the immense crowd was equally spellbound. The hermit paused and then began again, even more urgently. "Our fellow Christians cry for our help. Our blessed Pope, chosen by God himself, has called upon us to answer their cry. He has called for a crusade, a holy crusade, to force a way through to Jerusalem and liberate our brethren. I am answering that call, and you will answer it with me. Many already follow me. Many more must join." He paused again. There was a stir in the crowd, but still no one spoke. "Men, women, children, noblemen, serfs, beggars, even thieves and criminals, join me. Pope Urban has promised absolution to every one of you who participates in this venture, for forgiveness for all your sins. Your lives will be washed clean, your place in heaven assured. After we have succeeded in God's holy work, you will return pure to a new life. New lands will be yours for those of you who wish to stay. The way to Jerusalem will be open to all of us again. Jerusalem will be free." At this, as if released from their hypnosis, a roar went up from the people assembled around the monk. "Jerusalem! Jerusalem!" The cry grew louder and louder. Ursula was shocked into awareness of what was going on. She looked around her with growing uneasiness as the noise reached a frenzy. Instinctively, she reached for her father's arm. When she turned to look at him, however, he was still staring at Peter as if mesmerized. At that moment, Peter raised his hands again, and all this time it took several moments. At last the people quietened. "At the end of the month," he commanded, "at the end of this, the month when we mourn Christ's death and celebrate his most glorious resurrection, we will gather and we will set out on our quest. Leave your homes, leave your debts and your cares and your tiresome troubled lives. Join me to march for God and to slay anyone who oppose us. The cross, red as blood, as our crucified Savior, will be our symbol. Victory is certain to be ours. God wills it." The clamor of the crowd rose again, louder than before, and now there was no quelling it. "God wills it! God wills it!" Then, a mob now, they began to surge toward the man on the donkey. Only the actions of a gang of strong-bodied servants were able to clear a path for the hermit as he rode off. Ursula found herself shoved roughly from behind. She clutched even more tightly to her father's arm. She heard him gasp as he, too, was pushed and forced up against bodies in front of them. Her face was pressed into a sweating, roughly shirted back, and for a moment she panicked, almost suffocating. The jostling of the people around her caused her to lose her footing. She regained it, but realized with sudden horror that her father had fallen. She lost her grip on his arm, and before she could help him, the crowd swept her out of reach. "Father!" she screamed. A hand grabbed at her, and she yanked herself away in terror. "Ursula, it's me!" The hand caught hold of her again, and she recognized Bruno. "Father!" she cried. "He's fallen!" Bruno squeezed past her. By dint of sheer strength, he elbowed his way through to the older man and shielded him with his body as he helped him rise. Ursula managed to get to him as well. Then the three of them fought their way to the edge of the heaving mass. "Come," Bruno said, not allowing them time to rest. "We must get out of here. This is insanity." They made their way out of the meadow, but even then could not get completely away from the shouting, wrought-up people. The streets of the city itself were crammed, and all normal business had come to a halt. "I've never seen people like this," Ursula panted as she helped her father along behind Bruno. "I can't understand it." They were near the Jewish section of the city. Ursula recognized a respected Jewish scholar and his wife coming toward them. At the same time, a knot of men pushed past her from behind. Ursula could smell the stale odor of beer and wine mixed with sweat and filth. The men were dressed in coarse woolen cloaks with flaming red crosses, roughly painted on the shoulders. As they came abreast of the Jewish people, the leader reached out and pushed the old woman aside. His companions, following his lead, forced the man to stumble into the gutter. "Out of the way, Jews!" the leader cried. "Killers of Christ! Make way for those who would defend him." The man reached out instinctively to protect his wife, but the leader knocked him flat with one blow. Ursula heard her father exclaim in horror. She watched as the men strode off, laughing and shouting triumphantly, and then she and Bruno ran forward to assist the couple. The elderly man picked himself up and dusted himself off with dignity. He reached for the hand of his wife, who was sobbing helplessly, and comforted her. "I am not hurt, my love. Do not distress yourself. But Bishop Herman will hear of this. The Archbishop of Cologne is a good friend to the Jews in this city, and he will not tolerate such indignities." He turned to Ursula and Bruno. "Thank you, my children, for your concern, but we are perfectly all right." With a courteous bow to Master William, they continued on their way. Ursula stood looking after them. She was shaking with anger as she reached for her father's arm again, but mixed in with it was fear. What was happening here? She turned to her father. He was staring after the man and his wife, obviously dazed and still confused with all that had happened. "I need a draught of wine to wash the taste of this out of my mouth." Bruno's voice startled her. She looked at him quickly. On his face was the same expression he had worn when he had seen the thief about to lose his hand. Then he turned to them, and his face changed as he saw Master William's distress. "Your father needs a place to sit and rest himself. My hut is close by. Will you come?" Ursula felt a great need to sit down herself. She nodded wordlessly. The old Roman wall still protected Cologne, and Bruno's hut, made of wattle and thatch, was built up against it on the southern side of the city, near one of the gates. There was no window, and the only light came from the door, which he had left open. Ursula squinted into the gloom as she entered. As her eyes grew accustomed to the dark, she saw a straw pallet in one corner of the room, a coffer sitting against the far wall, and a small trestle table were the only other pieces of furniture. The floor was hard-packed earth, with a few fresh rushes sown over it. The remains of a fire nestled up to the ancient stones of the wall. An opening cut into the roof above let in practically no light, but would, it was to be hoped, let out the smoke when the fire was lit. Bruno led Master William over to the coffer. Exhausted, the older man sank down onto it. Ursula sat beside him. "Will you have wine, master?" Bruno offered. He picked up a flask and poured it into a horn. Ursula's father accepted it gratefully. "Are you hungry?" A bit of stale cheese and the remains of a loaf of black bread sat on the trestle. Bruno brushed a swarm of flies off them. "Would you like something to eat?" Master William shook his head. "Thank you, no. I will just rest a moment. That's all I need." Bruno looked to Ursula. "No," Ursula blurted out. "Thank you," she added hastily. She would have had to be starving indeed before she ate leftover food such as that. Bruno flushed. "My hut is rather poor," he said stiffly, "but at least it is a hut of a free man." Ursula was startled. It hadn't occurred to her that he might be otherwise. "My parents are country people," he explained. "Serfs belonging to Count Emil. Half their yearly harvest, poor as it is, must go to him. There was not enough to feed all the hungry mouths at home, so I left and came to the city. By God's grace, it was found that I had a talent with stonework. Now, by having lived in the city for a year, I am granted my freedom, and so am no longer Count Emil's man but my own." Ursula nodded, for a moment at a loss as to what to say. But then she returned to the subject that was uppermost in her mind. The figure of Peter the Hermit was still before her, and his words still echoed. "What thought you of the preacher?" she asked. "A strange man," Bruno answered, "and strangely compelling, dangerously compelling." "Why say you that?" Master William broke in. "I liked not what he had to say," Bruno answered. "He stirs people up for this crusade, saying it is a holy venture, and yet he speaks of killing. True Christians cannot kill. It is a sin." "But it is in God's name," Master William protested. "To further God's will, to liberate our brethren in the East." "Thou shalt not kill. Is that not one of our commandments?" Bruno answered. "Our Lord Jesus never took arms against any man, and yet he wrought more change in our world than anyone else before him." "But the Pope himself has called for this. Are you condemning the Pope?" Master William staggered to his feet, wine spilling from the horn in his hand. "This Peter is a holy man. He may be a saint. Are you saying he is not preaching God's word?" The hand holding the horn of wine began to shake, so Bruno had to grab for it. Master William's face flushed, and his watery blue eyes shone suddenly as if with tears. "Father, calm yourself!" Ursula sprang up and reached to steady him. "I am saying I cannot believe that a true Christian should ever kill," Bruno answered, his face anxious but his voice stubborn. "It goes against all that we are taught." "This crusade is a holy thing, Master William insisted, but his voice was striddy and weak. His whole body began to shake. "You are upsetting him," Ursula snapped. "Can you not see what you are doing?" "And do you agree with what the monk preached?" Bruno challenged her. "He is preaching violence, not brotherly love. Violence breeds violence, and is hard to contain once lit." "I know not what I agree with. I know only that my father is in distress. Thank you for your wine. We will go home now." But as she led her father through the alleys to their shop, she could not rid herself of the memory of the old Jewish couple being pushed into the gutter. "Violence breeds violence," Bruno's words echoed in her mind, "and it is hard to contain once lit." "Would that I could go on such a crusade," Master William said wistfully as they entered their home. "Would it not be wonderful, Ursula, to see Jerusalem and to be one of the number that set it free for all Christians again?" Ursula looked at David, sitting silently by the fire patting Samson, and did not reply. The next day, Easter Sunday, was a day usually spent in prayer and celebration. Ursula and her father joined in with their neighbors in the procession that wound through the city to the bishop's church, but it worried her that the rough crowds of strangers bearing their red crosses still thronged the streets, drinking and carousing. By Monday morning, things at first seemed to be back to normal. Then, just as Ursula was beginning to prepare the noon meal, Bruno burst through the door. David, who was sitting by the fire, leapt to his feet, startled. Samson let out a low growl before he realized who it was. There are riots, Bruno announced. The Crusaders have been working themselves up all weekend, and now they are searching out all the Jews they can find, and crying that the killers of Christ must be punished before the crusade can begin. People are hiding them, and the archbishop has given sanctuary to as many as he could in the bishop's church, but the mobs are out of control. I must get back to my uncle's house, David cried. He started for the door. It's too late. The streets are full. You would be struck down at once, Bruno answered. Stay here, David, Ursula said, stopping him. Your mother and your uncle will be safe with the archbishop, I'm sure. You'll be safe here. I'm not even certain of that, Bruno answered. This is a rabble, and it has gone wild. They're forcing their way into private houses to seek out any hidden Jews and dragging them into the streets. I must go, David cried again. You will never make it. The crowd was following behind me as I came. As if to prove Bruno's words, distant shouting could be heard coming rapidly closer. We must hide him, Ursula said desperately. Quickly, up the stairs to the loft. No, there is a better place, Master William spoke for the first time. The others looked at him, surprised. David, quickly now, follow me down into the cellar. Ursula stared at her father, startled by the unaccustomed note of sharp authority in his voice. David turned to obey. The cellar? Father, there is no hiding place there. Her father didn't answer, but hustled David toward the trap-door set into the floor in the far corner of the room. Before Ursula could recover from her astonishment, they disappeared down it together, and her father pulled the wooden planking closed behind them. Almost at the same time, a wave of rioting, shouting men broke into their narrow alley. Ursula and Bruno ran to the doorway and watched, aghast, as the mob surged toward them. 5 broke off from the rest and pushed past into the house. Bruno tried to stop them, but was knocked to the floor. Samson growled in earnest this time, and sank his teeth into the leg nearest to him. A kick sent him sprawling, yipping with fresh pain. Ursula felt herself grabbed and thrust against the wall. It is said that you harbor a Jew here. Where is he? The leader demanded. His heavy, bearded face was only inches away from her own, and the stench of rotting teeth sickened her. She wondered briefly how they found out about David, then knew. Mistress Ingrid, no doubt, had been quick to provide the information. Bruno made an effort to rise and was knocked down again. His head hit the stones of the fireplace, and he lay suddenly still. A Jew boy, he comes every day. Where is he? He came not today, Ursula managed to get out. You're lying. You're hiding him, the man shook Ursula against the wall so violently she felt her head swim. No, she gasped. He came not today, she repeated. We'll soon see about that. With a wave of his hand, he sent 2 men toward the stairs. He held Ursula, and she watched as they disappeared from sight. There were curses and sounds of stools and coffers being thrown around. Then they came back down. No one's there. I know he's here somewhere. The leader loosed Ursula and looked around thoughtfully. There must be a cellar. There! He pointed triumphantly to the trap-door and sprang towards it. Ursula let out an involuntary cry. Ha-ha! No Jew, eh? He threw back the door and disappeared down the steps. The cellar was a vast room, where Ursula and her father stored vegetables and their supplies of herbs and ointments. It was old, far older than the house itself, full of arched nooks and crannies. The walls were carved with grotesque heads of mystical beasts and wild animals. Dark and dank, it was even frightening, but there were no hiding places there. Ursula knew that. Not even for a small boy. Certainly not for a small boy and an old man.